Hey, now, before we get started, I just need to remind you that my Falcons beat them Cowboys yesterday. But enough of that. Today we're going to discuss the midpoint. The midpoint is a formula, and the distance is also a formula. Now notice this stuff, x's and y's. It looks like the linear stuff from Algebra 1, or it looks like the slope formula almost when you kind of look at some of these. That's because we are using ordered pair, coordinates, x comma y. And so what we're looking for is, where is the middle point on between 2 points? Or what is the length or the distance between 2 points? And so these two formulas are going to be our basis for today. Now, we have this example here, and it asks us to find the distance between these 2 points. And so let's take a look at that and go from there. All right, so here's the idea of today. What I'm trying to do, if I have these 2 points, here's the point 2 up 3. That's the point 2, 3. And the point negative 5. I don't know why I can't count. And up 1. I want to know the distance between those 2 points. Okay? Now, if this was a horizontal line or a vertical line, I can find that distance, but I don't know the distance between those two or where the midpoint is exactly and specifically. So what we're going to do is find both the length or the distance between those 2 points and where the middle point is between those two. So let's start off with the midpoint. All right, so we're going to use this example here. The midpoint of those 2 points would be to use this formula here, which basically says to take the average, add both x's together, and divide by 2. So this is the x, and this is the x. This is the first point, this is the second point. This is the y and the y. This is the first point and the second point. You can label them like that if you want, or if you understand what they are. The formula says to add the x's together, so that's 2 plus negative 5 over 2, and look at the formula, is written in terms of a point, comma 3 plus 1 over 2. And so that becomes negative 3 over 2, comma 4 over 2, which is just 2. And so that could be your answer, or I would accept negative 1 and 1/2, comma 2. Depending on the problem, or if I tell you you can use decimals, you can use decimals. But that would be the midpoint. Let's look at that. Negative 1 and 1/2, comma 2. Let's see if that makes sense. Negative 1 and 1/2 up 1, 2. That looks like it makes sense to me. When you look at that, that's about the midpoint. Negative 1.5 up 1, 2 is your midpoint. Alrighty. Let's go for the distance. The distance is using this formula here. And so, again, I'm going to use those same points. And so I'm going to use d for distance equals the square root of negative 5 minus 2 squared plus 1 minus 3 squared. Now, truthfully, the order that you subtract those, as long as you put the x's first, the y second, it doesn't really matter because you're going to square them both. So d equals the square root of negative 7 squared plus negative 2 squared. So d equals the square root of 49 plus 4, which equals square root of 53. Now, they may ask you, all right, if they say to round, I put that in my calculator and I get 7.28, so that's approximately 7.3, depending on how many decimal places they tell you to add it. But I am going to stop right there unless I give you other instructions. All right. So that's units. We don't know like the units. I could put a length on it if I was saying each block on my grid was a mile or something. But anyway, the distance is the square root of 53, and that's approximately 7.3 spaces there. Let's take another look at another. Well, look at another one. We got those 2 points, 2, -1, and 2, 5. Let's look at another one. 2, -1, and 2, 5. 2, -1, so over 2, -1, and 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so we want to know the distance between those two. Now notice that these are vertical. These 2 points are vertical. And we want to know the midpoint. So I can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the length or the distance should be 6 units. And the midpoint should be this point right here, which is 2, 2. So 2, 2, I'm going to write that down, is our midpoint according to our picture, and 6 was our distance. Let's see if that holds true. Let's see if that holds true. Okay, using the midpoint, the formula says add the x's together. So that is 2 plus 2 over 2. And that is -1 plus 5 over 2. 2 plus 2 is 4. 4 divided by 2 is, yes, that's right, 2. Thank you for answering, imaginary person. -1 plus 5 is 4 divided by 2 is 2. Well, looky here. That turned out to be right, our midpoint. Our distance is found by doing d equals the square root of 2 minus 2 plus 5 minus a -1. Be careful with your signs. And so 2 minus 2 is 0, and 0 squared is just 0. 5 minus a -1 becomes plus 1, which is the square root of 36, which equals 6. So our distance is also 6, based on our picture. The only issue is it only works if you got a vertical line or a horizontal line that you can kind of look at that and kind of guesstimate that. So it doesn't always work with just looking at a picture. Let's look at our last example here. And you might want to do this, pause the video, and see if you can figure this out by yourself, and then come back to see what your answer is. Okay, so let's do the distance first. Why? Because I can. It tells me to find segment AB. I don't have to actually find the midpoint on here, but I probably will just for practice. The distance would be the square root of 4 minus -7 squared plus -3 minus 5 squared. And so that becomes 11. 4 plus 7 is 11. So D equals the square root of 121, that's 11 squared, plus -3 minus 5 is -8. -8 times -8 is 64. And again, don't forget your radical sign, the square root sign. It follows you. So D equals, what is that, 185, the square root of 185. And the square root of 185 is the same thing as approximately 13.6. Again, it depends on how many decimal places you have to go, but I want the radical answer. That's just on some problems they may ask you to give it in a decimal form. So that's the distance there. Now, let's look at the midpoint, which would be -3. Excuse me, it wouldn't be -3. I was just checking to see if you were paying attention. It would be 4 plus -7. You say, well, you do it in a different order. You just add them and take the average. And 5 plus -3. 4 plus -7 is -3/2. And 5 plus -3 is 2/2, which equals 1. Or that's the same thing as 1.5, comma 1. So either one of those. Alright, so now we have figured out how to do the distance and the midpoint. Go Falcons.